The deepest wounds are not the ones everyone can see. They are the ones no one ever thinks to ask about. Morning light spilled through the towering windows of the royal healing chamber, painting long ribbons of gold across polished stone floors that had witnessed generations of kings. The room smelled of crushed herbs, cedar smoke, and freshly brewed medicine, yet none of those familiar comforts could soften the uneasy silence lingering in the air. One by one, the kingdom's finest healers entered carrying polished wooden cases filled with rare remedies, enchanted salves, and carefully prepared bandages. Each had traveled for days hoping to restore the Alpha King's legendary battle scar. Yet every visit ended exactly the same way. The moment the linen covering his shoulder was gently folded aside, confident voices disappeared. Some healers lowered their eyes. Others hesitated before taking another step. A few quietly apologized, claiming they needed stronger medicine before leaving the chamber, without touching the wound at all. The scar stretched from Adrian Whitmore's left shoulder across the upper part of his chest, pale silver beneath his fair skin, marked with faint shimmering lines that no ordinary injury should have carried. It no longer bled. It no longer threatened his life. Still, something about it unsettled everyone who looked too closely. The room gradually emptied until only the royal physician remained beside the door, wearing an expression heavy with disappointment. "Your Majesty," the elderly physician said carefully, "there is only one apprentice healer left who has not yet been examined by the council." Adrian fastened the linen shirt over his shoulder again without emotion. "Then send her in." A few moments later, the chamber door opened quietly. Grace Sullivan stepped inside carrying a simple leather satchel that looked far too ordinary compared with the elaborate cases brought by the others. She was a young Omega with fair skin, calm blue eyes, and chestnut hair gathered neatly behind her shoulders. Her clothing was practical rather than elegant, and flour from the herbal workshop still lightly dusted one sleeve, where she had spent the morning grinding dried roots into medicine. She paused just inside the doorway and respectfully bowed. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Adrian studied her with quiet curiosity. Unlike the others, she did not stare at the scar hidden beneath his shirt, as though expecting to see something frightening. She first looked into his eyes, offering the same calm expression she might have given any ordinary patient. The royal physician cleared his throat. "Miss Sullivan recently completed her healer's training. She has little experience with royal patients." Adrian almost smiled. "That may be an advantage." Grace approached slowly after washing her hands in warm herbal water. She carefully arranged fresh bandages and clean cloth upon the nearby table before looking toward the Alpha King. "May I examine the scar?" she asked gently. Adrian nodded once and loosened the linen covering his shoulder. Grace's eyes settled upon the pale silver mark. She did not gasp. She did not step backward. She simply observed it quietly, noticing not only its unusual shape but also the slight stiffness in the way Adrian held his arm. Several silent moments passed while sunlight drifted across the chamber. Finally, Grace reached for a fresh cloth soaked in warm water and carefully rested it near the edge of the scar. Her touch remained steady, respectful, and remarkably gentle. Adrian found himself watching her instead of the treatment. He had grown accustomed to fear hidden behind polite smiles. Yet there was none in her expression, only thoughtful attention. After replacing the cloth, Grace looked up at him with sincere concern reflected in her eyes. Her voice remained soft enough that it barely disturbed the silence surrounding them. "May I ask you something, Your Majesty?" Adrian inclined his head. Grace hesitated only for a heartbeat before quietly asking the one question no healer had ever spoken inside these walls. "Does it still hurt?" The chamber became so still that even the crackling fire seemed to fade into silence, and for the first time in many years, Alpha King Adrian Whitmore discovered that he did not know how to answer. Adrian Whitmore did not answer immediately. "Grace." Sullivan's quiet question lingered in the healing chamber long after the words themselves had faded into silence. The elderly royal physician lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable, while several attendants standing near the doorway exchanged uncertain glances. Every healer before Grace had asked about the scar's appearance, its unusual markings, or the strange silver lines that shimmered beneath the skin whenever moonlight touched them. No one had ever asked whether the man carrying the scar still lived with its pain. Adrian slowly looked away toward the tall windows overlooking the palace gardens where the first hints of spring stirred among the ancient trees. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the chair, thoughtful rather than tense. Finally, he spoke in a voice so quiet it almost disappeared beneath the gentle crackling of the fireplace. "I am not certain." Grace did not rush to fill the silence. She simply waited. Adrian drew a slow breath before continuing. "The scar itself rarely hurts anymore." He paused once again, searching for words that had remained buried for years. "Some mornings I forget it is even there." Grace nodded softly, listening without interruption. "But there are other mornings?" she asked. Adrian's eyes met hers. Something in her expression made pretending feel unnecessary. "There are mornings when I remember everything." The room fell silent once more. Grace carefully folded a fresh linen cloth before placing it beside the warm bowl of herbal water. "Scars often remind the body where it has been," she said gently. "Sometimes they remind the heart as well." The elderly physician looked toward her with quiet surprise. This was not a lesson found in medical books. It was simple human understanding. Adrian watched Grace for another long moment. There was no pity in her eyes. No fear.
No fascination.
Only calm compassion that expected nothing from him. She carefully dipped the clean cloth into warm water infused with lavender and mountain herbs before gently placing it against the edge of the scar. Her movements remained steady and respectful, never hurried, never hesitant. "Does this feel too warm?" she asked. Adrian shook his head.
No.
"Too cool?"
No.
Grace smiled faintly. "Then we found the right temperature." The small remark almost drew a smile from Adrian himself. It had been years since anyone inside these walls had spoken to him with such ordinary kindness. Most conversations revolved around military reports, royal decrees, alliances, or ceremonies. Even physicians usually treated him more like a symbol than a patient. Grace quietly replaced the cloth after several moments, observing how the tightness around his shoulder eased ever so slightly. "The scar does not concern me," she admitted. Adrian raised an eyebrow. "It does not." She shook her head. "Scars tell me someone survived something difficult. I pay more attention to the person who carried it here." Those simple words settled deep inside Adrian's thoughts. No elaborate speech could have reached him more deeply. Before leaving, Grace gathered her satchel and neatly arranged the unused bandages upon the table. She bowed respectfully, just as she had when entering the chamber. "If you permit it, Your Majesty, I would like to continue your treatment tomorrow." Adrian looked toward the fading afternoon sunlight spilling across the floor before returning his gaze to the young Omega. For reasons he could not yet explain, the room no longer felt quite as heavy as it had that morning. "You may return," he answered quietly. Grace smiled with gentle gratitude before leaving the chamber. After the door closed behind her, the elderly royal physician slowly turned toward the Alpha King. "Did her treatment lessen the discomfort, Your Majesty?" Adrian looked toward the doorway, where Grace had disappeared only moments earlier. After a thoughtful silence, he answered with complete honesty. "No healer has ever eased the scar in a single visit. Today someone eased the silence around it, and somehow that feels far more important." That night, sleep refused to visit Adrian Whitmore no matter how quiet the palace became. Moonlight filtered through the tall windows of his private chamber, casting pale silver patterns across the polished floor while the fire slowly faded into glowing embers. He stood alone before an old mirror, his linen shirt hanging loosely from one shoulder as his eyes rested upon the familiar scar crossing his fair skin. For years he had looked at it only as a reminder of survival, a permanent mark carried by every morning and every royal ceremony. Yet tonight, he saw something different. He no longer remembered the expressions of the countless healers who had examined it. He remembered only one quiet voice asking a question no one else had thought to ask. "Does it still hurt?" The words echoed gently inside his thoughts. Adrian closed his eyes, surprised by how deeply such a simple question had reached him. It had not forced open old memories. It had simply given them permission to exist. Across the palace grounds, Grace Sullivan sat inside the small apprentice residence where young healers prepared herbs late into the evening. Fresh lavender hung drying above the windows while rows of neatly labeled glass jars covered the wooden shelves. Grace carefully recorded notes from the day's treatment, describing the unusual silver lines beneath the scar and the stiffness she had noticed around the Alpha King's shoulder. She paused before writing another sentence. Instead of describing the wound, she quietly wrote, "Patient speaks more easily after being heard than after being treated." She looked at the words for a long moment before gently closing the journal. Meanwhile, inside the royal library, Theodore Hawthorne found Adrian studying weathered medical volumes that had not been opened for decades. "Your Majesty," Theodore said with mild surprise, "you rarely visit this room at such a late hour." Adrian smiled faintly, without looking up. "I was searching for something." Theodore glanced toward the old books spread across the table. "Have you found it?" Adrian slowly shook his head.
No.
"I realized I have been searching in the wrong place." Theodore waited patiently. "Every book explains how scars heal," Adrian continued thoughtfully. "None explains why some continue hurting long after the wound is closed." Theodore considered those words before answering quietly. "Perhaps because books understand the body better than the heart." Adrian closed the final volume and looked toward the moon beyond the library windows. Grace seemed to understand both. The following morning arrived with clear skies and cool spring air drifting through the palace gardens. Birds gathered among blooming branches while servants quietly prepared the royal healing chamber for another appointment. The elderly physician noticed Adrian arriving several minutes early, something that had never happened before. "You seem unusually punctual today, Your Majesty," he observed with a gentle smile. Adrian glanced toward the chamber door before answering with calm honesty. "I am curious to continue yesterday's conversation." Moments later, the door opened and Grace entered carrying the same simple leather satchel. She greeted every person in the room with the same quiet respect before placing fresh herbs and clean linen upon the treatment table. Nothing about her manner suggested nervousness or excitement despite standing once again before the Alpha King. To her, he remained exactly what he had been yesterday, a patient deserving patience. Adrian watched her prepare the warm herbal water with careful attention. For the first time in many years, the healing chamber no longer felt like a place where people measured his strength. Instead, it felt like the one room inside the palace where he could quietly set the weight of the crown aside for a little while and simply be a man carrying an old scar that someone had finally cared enough to understand. Morning after morning, the healing chamber settled into a gentle routine that slowly became familiar to them both. Grace Sullivan always arrived a few minutes early, carrying fresh herbs gathered from the palace gardens before sunrise and warm linen cloths prepared with careful attention. She never hurried through the treatment, never spoke more than necessary, and never filled the silence simply because it existed. Adrian Whitmore gradually discovered that those quiet moments brought him an unexpected sense of peace. While other healers focused entirely on the scar itself, Grace seemed to notice everything surrounding it. One morning she adjusted the chair slightly closer to the window before beginning her work. "The sunlight will help warm the room," she explained with a soft smile. Another day, she quietly opened the window just enough for fresh spring air to drift inside. Sometimes the body relaxes more easily when it remembers the seasons are changing. Adrian found himself looking forward to these small details more than the treatments themselves. As Grace carefully replaced the clean bandages, she spoke in the same calm voice she used with every patient. "May I ask how your shoulder feels today?" Adrian gently rotated his arm before answering. "Less stiff than last week." Grace nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Then we are making progress." She never celebrated too quickly. She simply acknowledged each small improvement as though every step mattered. That simple habit made even the slowest changes feel meaningful. The elderly royal physician observed their conversations from across the room with growing curiosity. He had spent decades treating warriors, nobles, and members of the royal family, yet he had rarely witnessed a patient become calmer simply because someone listened without judgment. During one visit, After Grace finished applying a fresh herbal salve, Adrian unexpectedly asked, "Why did you become a healer?" Grace carefully cleaned her hands before answering. "When I was a child, my grandmother often reminded me that medicine is important, but people sometimes need to feel understood before they can begin to heal. I wanted to learn both." Adrian considered those words for several quiet moments. Most people believe strength means pretending nothing hurts. Grace gently folded another clean cloth before meeting his eyes. Pretending may hide pain, but it cannot carry it away. Neither of them spoke after that. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. As the days passed, Grace noticed something else. The faint silver lines woven beneath the scar appeared to shimmer more brightly whenever Adrian relaxed, then faded again whenever he forced himself back into the rigid posture expected of a king. Curious, she leaned a little closer while changing the bandage, studying the delicate pattern beneath the skin. It did not resemble ordinary scar tissue.
The
silver strands curved with remarkable precision, almost like ancient writing hidden beneath the surface. Grace lightly touched the edge of one glowing line with the back of her fingertips. The shimmer responded with a soft pulse before becoming still again. She frowned thoughtfully, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity. "This is unusual," she murmured almost to herself. Adrian followed her gaze. "Have you seen anything like it before?" Grace slowly shook her head. "Not exactly." She hesitated before continuing. "It feels less like an old wound and more like something waiting." The words lingered between them as sunlight streamed across the chamber floor. Adrian looked down at the silver markings that had puzzled the kingdom's greatest healers for years. For the first time, he no longer wondered only how the scar had formed. He found himself wondering why it had chosen to reveal something new only after a young Omega had looked beyond the wound and quietly remembered to ask whether the man carrying it still hurt. Several more days passed, and the quiet rhythm inside the healing chamber remained unchanged. Every morning Grace Sullivan prepared fresh herbal compresses while sunlight drifted across the polished stone floor, and every morning Adrian Whitmore found himself setting aside reports from generals and advisors without reluctance because, for one peaceful hour, he could simply be a patient instead of a king. His shoulder moved more freely now, and the constant tightness surrounding the scar had begun to ease. Yet the strange silver lines beneath his fair skin continued to puzzle Grace. They did not behave like ordinary scar tissue. Some mornings they appeared almost invisible. Other mornings they shimmered faintly beneath the surface, as though responding to something beyond medicine. Grace decided to study them more carefully. After gently replacing the bandage, she carried several weathered medical journals from the palace library into the chamber. Their pages described battle injuries, enchanted illnesses, and rare herbal treatments collected over hundreds of years. She spent hours comparing illustrations to the markings she had observed on Adrian's shoulder. Nothing matched. Even the oldest records described scars as fixed reminders of healed wounds. None spoke of silver patterns that quietly shifted like living branches beneath the skin. The elderly royal physician noticed the growing stack of open books and smiled kindly. "Have you found an answer?" Grace slowly shook her head. "Only more questions." He walked closer, adjusting his spectacles before studying one faded illustration beside another. "I searched these same volumes many years ago," he admitted. "I never discovered anything useful." Grace gently closed one journal before looking back toward Adrian, who sat patiently near the window reading correspondence from neighboring kingdoms. "Perhaps we have been searching in the wrong section." That afternoon, while applying a fresh herbal balm, Grace noticed something new. As Adrian relaxed his shoulder, one delicate silver line brightened and curved toward the center of the scar, joining several others until they formed the faint outline of a crescent moon. She leaned closer, her blue eyes widening with quiet fascination. "Your Majesty," she whispered, "may I ask you to take one slow breath?" Adrian followed her instruction. As he exhaled, the silver crescent glowed a little brighter before slowly fading again. Grace remained perfectly still. She had seen enough to know this was no illusion. "What is it?" Adrian asked calmly. Grace hesitated before answering. "I do not believe the scar is only the memory of an old injury. She gently traced the air a few inches above the glowing pattern without touching it. These markings resemble an ancient moon mark, but not one I have ever studied. Adrian looked thoughtfully toward his shoulder. The physicians who treated me after the battle believed magic had become trapped inside the wound. Grace nodded slowly. Perhaps they were partly correct. She reached for another journal she had carried with her that morning, opening it to a fragile page filled with hand-drawn symbols copied from forgotten royal archives. Most of the markings looked unfamiliar, but one small illustration immediately caught her attention. It showed delicate silver lines curving into the same crescent shape she had just witnessed beneath Adrian's skin. Her heartbeat quickened. Beneath the drawing, faded ink recorded only a single sentence that time had almost erased. Some marks cannot awaken through power alone. They answer only when the heart remembers how to heal. Grace quietly read the words again, while sunlight warmed the chamber. Adrian watched her thoughtful expression without speaking. Neither of them yet understood what the ancient message truly meant, but both sensed they had just stepped beyond the limits of ordinary medicine and into a mystery that had been waiting many years for someone willing to look beyond the scar itself. The ancient sentence refused to leave Adrian Whitmore's thoughts long after the medical journals had been returned to the library. Some marks cannot awaken through power alone. They answer only when the heart remembers how to heal. He repeated the words quietly while standing alone on the palace balcony that evening, watching the moon rise above the distant mountains. For years he had believed the scar represented nothing more than sacrifice and duty. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether it had been waiting for something entirely different. The following morning, Grace Sullivan entered the healing chamber carrying a small wooden box filled with freshly gathered herbs, but her attention was drawn less to the medicines than to Adrian himself. He looked more rested than usual. The heavy weariness that had often settled behind his silver eyes seemed lighter, as though a quiet burden had begun to loosen. She smiled warmly. "You slept better." Adrian looked mildly surprised. "Is it that obvious?" Grace nodded. People breathe differently after a peaceful night. A faint smile touched his face. "Then perhaps your treatments are working in more ways than one." Grace gently prepared the warm herbal cloth while sunlight poured through the tall windows. As she carefully replaced the bandage, Adrian studied the thoughtful expression on her face. "You have been thinking about the journal," he observed. "I have," Grace admitted. "Not only the journal. Something you said during our first meeting." Adrian looked at her curiously. "Which part?" Grace secured the fresh linen before answering softly. "When you said there are mornings when you remember everything." The room grew quiet again, but this silence no longer felt uncomfortable. Adrian rested his gaze on the garden beyond the windows where white blossoms swayed gently in the spring breeze. "I remembered more last night," he confessed. Grace waited patiently. "Not the battle," Adrian continued. "Something from years before it." He closed his eyes for a moment as the memory slowly returned. He was still a young prince traveling through the countryside with only a small escort when a frightened foal became trapped beneath the fallen branch of an old oak after a storm. While several soldiers argued about the quickest way to free the frightened animal, a little girl quietly knelt beside it. She never tried to pull it free. She simply rested one gentle hand against its neck and whispered, "You are safe now. We will not hurry your fear away." Adrian remembered watching in astonishment as the trembling animal slowly calmed, allowing everyone to lift the branch without panic. Before leaving, the little girl had smiled at him and said words he had never forgotten completely. "Healing begins when someone feels safe enough to stop pretending they are not hurting." Adrian opened his eyes slowly. "I had forgotten that memory for many years." Grace stood perfectly still. Her heartbeat quickened for reasons she could not explain. The words felt strangely familiar, as though she had heard them long ago in another season of her life. She looked down thoughtfully while adjusting the edge of the bandage. "My grandmother used to say something very similar," she whispered. "She believed pain becomes lighter the moment someone no longer has to carry it alone." Adrian looked at Grace with quiet wonder. As those words settled between them, the silver lines beneath the scar shimmered once again, brighter than ever before. This time neither of them looked away. They watched in silent amazement as the faint crescent expanded into a graceful pattern that resembled moonlit branches reaching toward the center of the scar, as though an ancient memory had finally begun recognizing the gentle heart standing only a few feet away. News of the Alpha King's improving health quietly spread throughout the palace, but no one understood the true reason behind it. Courtiers praised the rare herbs. Royal physicians credited careful treatment. Advisors believed the burden of recent affairs had simply become lighter. Only Adrian Whitmore and Grace Sullivan knew that the greatest change had begun long before any medicine touched the scar. It had begun with one gentle question and the silence that followed. A week later, the Royal Council gathered for the annual spring assembly inside the Great Hall. Noble families, military commanders, scholars, and representatives from every province filled the towering chamber beneath colorful banners displaying the history of the kingdom. According to tradition, the Alpha King wore ceremonial robes that completely concealed the scar across his shoulder. It had always remained hidden during official appearances. Not because anyone demanded it, but because Adrian had quietly chosen to let the kingdom remember only its strongest king. As palace attendants prepared the ceremonial cloak, Adrian looked at his reflection in the polished mirror. His hand rested thoughtfully upon the silver markings that had grown brighter over the past several days. Theodore Hawthorne entered carrying the royal seal before noticing the untouched cloak. "Your Majesty, the council is waiting." Adrian nodded slowly, but did not reach for the heavy garment. "How many years have I hidden this?" Theodore answered gently. "Since the day you returned from the northern campaign." Adrian looked toward the morning sunlight pouring through the open windows. Perhaps it is time they stopped seeing only the part of the story that looks strong. A few moments later, the great doors of the assembly hall opened. Every guest rose respectfully as Adrian entered. Quiet whispers immediately spread through the gathering. Instead of wearing the traditional ceremonial cloak, the Alpha King had chosen a simple formal jacket that left the upper portion of the silver scar visible above the collar. The unusual markings shimmered softly beneath the daylight, no longer hidden from curious eyes. Grace stood quietly near the royal physicians, surprised by his unexpected decision. Adrian walked calmly to the center of the hall before addressing the assembly. "For many years," he began, "this scar has been treated as a symbol of strength. Many believed it reminded me of victory." He paused, allowing the silence to settle naturally. "The truth is that it also reminded me of pain, loneliness, and every moment I believed I had to carry both in silence." The vast chamber became perfectly still. No one had ever heard their king speak so openly about himself. Adrian continued with quiet honesty. "Many gifted healers examined this wound. They offered remarkable knowledge and sincere effort. I remain grateful to every one of them." He turned gently toward Grace, whose blue eyes reflected quiet surprise. Then one young Omega asked a question that no one else had ever asked. Every face in the hall followed his gaze. Adrian smiled softly. She did not ask how the scar happened. She did not ask whether it could disappear. She simply asked whether it still hurt. Grace lowered her eyes, humbled by the attention. Adrian looked back toward the gathered nobles. "That single question reminded me that before I was your king, I was simply another person who had lived through difficult days." A thoughtful silence spread across the room, replacing surprise with quiet understanding. For the first time, the silver markings beneath Adrian's scar glowed openly beneath the spring sunlight without fear or shame, and many who witnessed them realized they were no longer looking at the mark of an old wound. They were looking at the beginning of a different kind of strength, one born not from hiding pain, but from finally allowing compassion to stand beside it. After the spring assembly ended, the atmosphere within the palace quietly changed in ways no royal decree could have commanded. Servants no longer whispered nervously whenever they caught sight of the Alpha King scar. Young guards who had once believed strength meant hiding every weakness began speaking openly about the burdens they carried. Even the royal physicians found themselves asking their patients different questions, remembering that healing did not always begin with medicine. Grace Sullivan returned to the healing chamber the following morning expecting another ordinary appointment. Instead, She found Adrian Whitmore standing beside the open window, overlooking the palace gardens where white blossoms drifted gently through the warm spring air. He had already removed the formal jacket from the previous day's ceremony, leaving only a simple linen shirt resting lightly over his shoulder. The silver markings beneath the fabric glowed faintly whenever sunlight reached them. Grace smiled as she entered. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Adrian turned toward her with an expression noticeably lighter than the one she had first encountered weeks earlier. "Good morning, Grace." There was no hesitation when he spoke her name now. It carried the natural ease of quiet friendship built through many patient conversations. Grace arranged her familiar collection of herbs upon the wooden table before gently examining the scar once again. She noticed immediately that the surrounding muscles no longer remained tense beneath her fingertips. The skin felt warmer, more relaxed, and the delicate silver pattern had become clearer than ever before. The crescent shape now stretched into graceful branches of light that seemed to flow naturally across the healed scar rather than struggle against it. Grace looked up with quiet amazement. "It is changing again." Adrian glanced toward his shoulder before smiling faintly. "Does that concern you?" She slowly shook her head.
No.
"It feels peaceful." She paused thoughtfully before adding, almost as though the scar has stopped fighting itself. Adrian reflected upon those words while watching petals drift beyond the window. "Perhaps I have stopped fighting it as well." Grace carefully replaced the final bandage, though she suspected it would soon no longer be necessary. She gathered the unused linen cloths before quietly saying, "You once believed the scar reminded everyone of your strength. Now it reminds them of your honesty." Adrian looked at her with sincere gratitude. "Because you reminded me there is a difference." For several peaceful moments, neither of them spoke. Birds sang beyond the gardens while warm sunlight filled the chamber with gentle light. Finally, Adrian stepped away from the window and extended his hand toward Grace. It was not a royal command, nor a formal ceremony. It was a simple invitation offered with quiet respect. "Walk with me." Grace looked at his outstretched hand before meeting his eyes. "Where are we going?" Adrian smiled. "Nowhere important." She laughed softly. "Then why invite me?" Adrian answered with complete honesty. "Because for many years, I walked every path alone. I would rather not do that anymore." Grace accepted his hand with calm warmth, and together they left the healing chamber, crossing the palace gardens beneath blooming trees where sunlight danced across winding stone paths. Courtiers who happened to see them did not witness a king leading a subject or a healer following her patient. They saw two people walking side by side, matching each other's pace without either one moving ahead. Above them, the silver lines beneath Adrian's scar shimmered gently in the morning light, no longer carrying the quiet loneliness of an old wound. Instead, they reflected something entirely new. They had become a living reminder that the deepest healing often begins the moment someone chooses to stand beside another person instead of merely trying to repair them. Summer arrived quietly, painting the palace gardens in shades of emerald and gold while the kingdom slowly embraced a lesson no one had expected to learn from its alpha king. The silver markings upon Adrian Whitmore's shoulder never disappeared. They no longer needed to. Instead of hiding beneath heavy ceremonial robes, the graceful pattern remained visible whenever he appeared before his people, reminding every visitor that true strength did not come from pretending to be untouched by hardship. Grace Sullivan continued serving as a royal healer, although those who knew her understood that her greatest gift had never been found inside jars of herbs or carefully folded bandages. It lived within her calm presence, her patient silence, and her remarkable ability to see the person standing behind every title. One warm evening, as the first full moon of summer rose above the palace, Adrian and Grace walked together through the quiet garden paths they had come to cherish. The fragrant air carried the scent of blooming roses and fresh lavender, while countless lanterns reflected softly across the peaceful fountains. Neither of them hurried. They had learned that some conversations became clearer when shared at the pace of an evening walk. Adrian paused beside an ancient stone bench where moonlight filtered gently through the branches overhead. The silver lines across his shoulder glowed with a calm radiance unlike anything either of them had witnessed before. Grace looked at the familiar pattern with quiet wonder. It no longer resembled a scar struggling to be understood. The shimmering branches had woven themselves into an elegant moon mark, flowing naturally across the healed skin, as though they had always belonged there. She smiled softly. "It is beautiful." Adrian looked down before meeting her eyes again. "For years I wished it would disappear." Grace gently shook her head. "Some stories are not meant to disappear. They are meant to remind us how far we have come." At that moment, the silver light spread gently across the final faded edge of the old scar before settling into complete stillness. There was no burst of magic, no overwhelming display of power. Only quiet peace. The ancient words Grace had discovered inside the forgotten journal finally made perfect sense. Some marks could not awaken through power alone. They answered only when the heart remembered how to heal. Adrian realized that the deepest wound had never been carried upon his shoulder. It had been the loneliness he had hidden beneath the weight of the crown. Grace had never tried to erase either burden. She had simply walked beside him until he no longer carried them alone. In the years that followed, the Royal Healing Academy adopted a new tradition inspired by their story. Every apprentice healer learned the same lesson before studying herbs, medicines, or ancient remedies. Their first responsibility was to understand the person before treating the illness. Visitors often noticed a simple sentence carved above the entrance to the academy. "Healing begins when someone feels seen." Travelers from distant kingdoms admired the Alpha King's wisdom, but those who remained long enough always discovered the quiet truth behind it. A single compassionate question had transformed not only one man's heart, but the spirit of an entire kingdom. Whenever children asked why the silver moon mark upon their king's shoulder shone so peacefully beneath the evening sky, Adrian always smiled before answering with gentle honesty. "Because one day, someone stopped looking at my scar and remembered to look at me." Grace would hear those words from somewhere nearby and smile to herself before returning to the people who needed her care, knowing that the greatest miracles rarely began with extraordinary power. More often, they began with one gentle heart, one moment of sincere compassion, and one simple question that reminded another soul they never had to face their pain alone again.